In our world of non-stop headlines, the biggest stories often happen in the quiet moments, far from any cameras. While we're all looking at a dozen different crises, a single conversation, a whisper between two world capitals, can change everything. What if I told you the most important geopolitical event of the last year wasn't a public summit or a declaration of war, but a single, unannounced phone call? A conversation that, for a little while, existed only on a secure line between Washington, D.C. and Beijing. This is the story of that phone call on February 4, 2026, between a newly inaugurated President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's a story pieced together from carefully chosen words in official statements, from what was said and maybe more importantly, from what wasn't. This is the story of how one conversation may have just set the stage for the next decade of global power, potentially redrawing the map of the world as we know it. We're going to break down what happened, why it's a huge deal, and what it signals for the United States, China, and Russia, with countries like Iran and Taiwan caught right in the middle. To really get the importance of this moment, you have to know what was happening. 2025 was a chaotic year for U.S.-China relations. After kicking off his second term, President Trump fired up the trade war again, at one point jacking up tariffs. But when Beijing didn't immediately fold and hit back with its own penalties, something shifted. By late 2025, the tough talk started to soften. Trump began praising Xi Jinping, and that old idea of a G2 era started floating around again. It all led to a one-year trade war truce when they met in Busan, South Korea on October 30, 2025. But that truce was shaky. Tensions were still simmering over tech, global influence, and of course Taiwan. The world was watching, wondering if this was a real reset or just a timeout. And that brings us to February 4, 2026. Neither country gave a heads up about the call. It happened just hours after President Xi had a virtual meeting with Russia's Vladimir Putin, where Putin confirmed he'd be visiting China sometime in the first half of the year. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a clear message. Any talk with Washington would happen against the backdrop of a stronger-than-ever Beijing-Moscow friendship. Right after the call, the spin began. Both sides said the conversation was positive, which itself is pretty rare. President Trump told reporters the call was all very positive and that his relationship with Xi was extremely good. China's official government account said the same, stating that President Xi put great importance to Sino-US relations. But underneath all that friendly language, the official readouts from Washington and Beijing told two completely different stories. They were a masterclass in diplomatic signaling, and they revealed a huge gap in what each side really cared about. The American readout was classic Trump, direct, all about the deal, and relentlessly optimistic. It zeroed in on tangible economic wins. It bragged about a massive promise from China to buy U.S. farm products, specifically an agreement to buy 20 million tons of soybeans this season, with a goal of 25 million for the next. It also hyped up big Chinese commitments to buy American oil and gas. The statement gave a brief nod to military topics being discussed, along with what it vaguely called the ongoing situations with Russia, Ukraine, and Iran. And in a big reveal, it announced President Trump's plan for a state visit to Beijing in April, framing it as the next step in what he called an excellent relationship. The Chinese readout, on the other hand, was strategic, formal, and packed with coded language. It was less about specific deals and more about setting the rules for the entire relationship. President Xi's statement started by emphasizing the need for mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation in 2026. To most people, that sounds like standard diplomatic fluff. But in the world of Chinese foreign policy, mutual respect is everything. For decades, it's been Beijing's way of telling the United States to respect its political system, its Communist Party, and its core interests. No judging, no interfering. It's a demand to be treated as a true equal, not a junior partner. The Chinese statement went on with a line that was both a promise and a warning. China always means what it says and matches its words with actions and results. This was a signal of resolve, a reminder that Beijing's promises are serious and its red lines aren't for sale. While the U.S. readout celebrated the soybean deal, the Chinese version didn't mention any numbers. Instead, it talked about both sides needing to address each other's concerns with equality and mutual benefit. This subtle framing suggests the purchases aren't a favor, they're part of a two-way street where China expects its own problems to be solved too. And then there was Taiwan. The American readout was short, just noting that the issue was discussed and that Trump had gotten assurances from Xi that there'd be no attack during his term. The Chinese readout was anything but short. President Xi drove home that the Taiwan question is the most important issue in China-U.S. relations and the first red line that must not be crossed. He stated flat out that Taiwan is China's territory and that China would never allow Taiwan to be separated. And most directly, the readout included a demand that the U.S. handle arms sales to Taiwan with prudence. So, this one phone call wasn't just a friendly chat, it was a high-stakes negotiation disguised as a courtesy call. Trump was claiming a victory, a huge trade deal that would sound great back home. Xi, meanwhile, was projecting strength and drawing the strategic lines for their next chapter. He was saying that sure, they could do business, but it would be on China's terms, and that issues of sovereignty, especially Taiwan, were not part of the deal. The stage was set, the lines were drawn, and the rest of us were left trying to figure out what it all really meant. To really get what happened on that call, you have to learn to read the language of power. The fact that the American and Chinese readouts were so different wasn't a mistake. It was the whole point. Each leader was talking to a few different audiences at once, their people back home, their allies, and of course, each other. Let's start with President Trump's style. It's always been direct, personal, and transactional. His statements are full of over-the-top words. Relations are excellent. The call was very positive. He focuses on his personal connection with other leaders. I like him. He likes me. This does two things. First, it boils down complex geopolitics into simple wins for a domestic audience. Announcing a 20 million ton soybean purchase is concrete. It's a number you can slap on a headline. It feels like a win. Second, it makes it seem like the relationship is all about the chemistry between two strong guys, suggesting problems can be solved with a handshake and force of will. It's classic deal-maker diplomacy. But that style often papers over the deep structural problems that actually define the U.S.-China relationship. By vaguely mentioning the situations in Iran and Ukraine were discussed, the American readout gives zero clues about what was actually said. Did they agree? Did they argue? Was the U.S. pushing China for help? Was China pushing back? The silence is deafening, and it's on purpose. It lets the White House sell a story of total success without getting messy with unresolved conflicts. It treats diplomacy like a business deal, where the only thing that matters is the final handshake. President Xi Jinping's approach is the complete opposite. It's patient, strategic, and tied to history and ideology. Where Trump makes a deal, Xi builds a structure. The language in the Chinese readout is a deliberate exercise in what experts call layered messaging. Every single phrase means something. Think about that call for mutual respect again. That's not just a pleasantry. It's a direct challenge to the world order that has existed since the Cold War, one that Beijing feels is dominated by American ideas. It's a demand for China to be seen not as a rising power asking for a seat at the table, but as the center of a new, multipolar world. The phrase win-win cooperation is another key one. It sounds great, but it's also a quiet jab at what China sees as America's zero-sum game, where for one side to win, the other has to lose. Chinese diplomacy also has a special vocabulary for showing disagreement, which makes its absence here pretty telling. For example, when a readout says the two sides had a candid exchange of views, that's code for "we argued and nobody budged." If it says they had a thorough exchange, it usually means things got heated. The fact that those phrases weren't in the February 4th readout and were instead replaced with talk of steering the relationship steadily forward through winds and storms suggests a choice to cool things down publicly while holding firm on their red lines in private. What the Chinese readout doesn't say is just as revealing. While Trump was bragging about soybeans and energy, Beijing's statement mentioned no numbers. That's a power move. It lets China keep its options open and avoid looking like it's giving in to American pressure. The purchase can be sold at home not as a concession to Trump, but as a smart move for China's own economy. Likewise, the Chinese readout was silent on hot-button issues like TikTok or fentanyl exports, even though those have been huge fights in the past. That silence doesn't mean the issues are gone. It means they're being kept as bargaining chips for later. But maybe the most important silence came from the American side. The U.S. readout said nothing about Xi's stark warning on Taiwan arms sales. Trump said they talked about Taiwan, but his statement didn't offer any sign that the U.S. would change its policy. This creates a dangerous gray area. Beijing has drawn its red line in bright, bold ink. Washington heard the warning but chose not to publicly acknowledge it. What we're seeing is a clash of diplomatic philosophies. The U.S., under Trump, sees the relationship as a series of deals to be won. China, under Xi, sees it as a long-term strategic game to be managed. Trump wants to score points. Xi wants to change the rules of the game. This call was a perfect snapshot of that, a loud American announcement of a deal, met with a quiet Chinese statement of principle. The future of global stability lies somewhere in the gap between those two messages. Of all the topics on that February 4th call, nothing is more dangerous or has more potential for disaster than Taiwan. For decades, the island has been the single most explosive issue in U.S.-China relations. And in this conversation, it was thrown onto the table with a clarity that was both shocking and deeply worrying. Like we said, the Chinese readout was crystal clear. President Xi didn't just mention Taiwan, he called it the very core of China's core interests, and the first red line that must not be crossed. In the world of Chinese diplomacy, you can't use stronger language than that. By saying Taiwan is China's territory and that its separation will never be allowed, Xi was repeating a non-negotiable part of China's national identity. The warning for the U.S. to act with prudence on arms sales wasn't a friendly tip. It was a direct demand tied to the health of the entire relationship. This intense focus on Taiwan wasn't new, but hearing it in the context of this call was a big deal. It signaled that Beijing is digging in. From China's point of view, the fragile truce on trade, the talk of presidential visits, all of it depends on how Washington handles Taiwan. The unspoken message is obvious. You can't separate business from security. You can't expect to sell us soybeans with one hand while arming what we consider a breakaway province with the other. On the American side, the response was, characteristically, a bit of a shrug. President Trump's public comments were all about his personal guarantee from Xi that China wouldn't attack. This is his deal-maker brain at work. He sees the issue as an agreement between two leaders, something that can be locked down with a handshake. But this personal promise, even if it cools things down for a bit, does nothing to solve the fundamental conflict. Under the Taiwan Relations Act, the United States is legally required to help Taiwan defend itself. China sees these arms sales as an attack on its sovereignty and as fuel for Taiwanese independence. This creates a dangerous loop where both sides think they're the ones playing defense. The U.S. sells weapons to maintain the peace and deter an attack. China sees those same weapons as an act of aggression that encourages separatism and justifies its own military buildup. The timing makes all this even more critical. There are recent reports that the U.S. is considering a massive new arms sale to Taiwan, a package that could be worth as much as $20 billion. This sale reportedly includes the exact kind of advanced missiles and air defense systems Taiwan would need to fight off a Chinese invasion. At the same time, people in Washington have been frustrated with political gridlock in Taipei that's held up Taiwan's own defense budget, making some question if they're committed to their own security. This puts the Trump administration in a tough spot. There's pressure to go ahead with the arms sale to show rock-solid support for Taiwan and to nudge Taipei into sorting out its budget mess. But President Xi's blunt warning, combined with the upcoming state visit to Beijing in April, creates huge pressure to delay or shrink that sale. For years, Chinese analysts have said that Beijing uses high-level visits as leverage to stop the U.S. from doing things it doesn't like. Well, now we're seeing that theory in action. Will Trump put the symbolic win of his Beijing trip ahead of the strategic need to arm Taiwan? This is where the phone call becomes the pivot point for global power. Taiwan is no longer just a flashpoint. It's a bargaining chip in a much bigger game. For Trump, the math might be whether he can trade a delay in arms sales for more solid wins from China on trade, or even for help in pressuring Iran. He might think he can get a better deal by putting Taiwan on the table. For Xi, the calculation is just as clear. He's testing America's commitment. By drawing such a bright red line, he's forcing Washington to make a choice. Every weapon sold to Taiwan from now on will be seen in Beijing as a personal insult, chipping away at the trust the two leaders say they're building. The risk is enormous. Some analysts worry that Xi is using the promise of a stable relationship to achieve a long-term goal, to slowly squeeze off American support for Taiwan until reunification, peaceful or not, is the only option left. The February 4th conversation didn't solve the Taiwan problem. If anything, it just raised the stakes. It turned an ongoing argument into the central test of this new U.S.-China relationship. Now, the world waits to see what happens next. The announcement of the next arms sale to Taiwan, or its delay, will be the first real sign of whether this phone call was the start of a real partnership or just the quiet before a much more dangerous storm. While the headlines from the Trump-Xi call focused on trade and Taiwan, the deepest shockwaves could reshape the entire global order. This conversation wasn't happening in a bubble. It took place inside a complex power triangle between the U.S., China, and Russia, with other key players like Iran watching nervously from the sidelines. The phone call, and the potential grand bargain it hints at, could sideline some world powers, promote others, and lock in a new geopolitical reality for years to come. Let's go back to the timing. The call happened just hours after Xi Jinping's virtual meeting with Vladimir Putin. In that meeting, the two leaders re-upped their no-limits partnership, a friendship built on their shared opposition to what they see as American global dominance. For years, the China-Russia alliance has been a growing counterweight to U.S. power. Their trade has exploded, and their militaries are working together more and more. Russia, slammed with Western sanctions over the war in Ukraine, has become totally dependent on China for economic life support and to buy its oil and gas. In return, China gets a secure supply of resources and a dependable partner in challenging the U.S. That's the world Donald Trump was looking at when he picked up the phone. Reaching out to Xi right after the Xi-Putin meeting looks like a classic divide-and-conquer move. The American readout's vague mention of discussing Russia, Ukraine, and Iran was probably the understatement of the year. What was likely being floated was a massive shift in how the world works, a new G2, or Group of Two, where the U.S. and China would become the primary managers of global security, pushing everyone else to the side. The unspoken offer from the American side seems to be this. The U.S. will give China the mutual respect and economic partnership it wants. In return, China will use its massive influence to help the U.S. solve its toughest problems. That means leaning on Moscow to help end the war in Ukraine on favorable terms, and, maybe even more importantly, using its economic chokehold on Tehran to stop Iran's nuclear program and regional aggression. That giant soybean deal Trump announced? That could be the down payment for this whole arrangement, a real benefit for the American heartland in exchange for China's help on the world stage. In this scenario, Russia and Iran aren't the main characters, they're pawns on the board. For Russia, this would be a disaster. After years of building a strategic friendship with Beijing, it would suddenly find itself demoted to a junior partner, its future being decided in a phone call between Washington and Beijing. The Xi-Putin partnership has been good for both, but it's never been a partnership of equals. China's economy is vastly larger than Russia's, and Beijing has always been careful not to give Moscow a blank check, especially if it could get China in trouble with Western sanctions. If forced to choose between a volatile, sanctioned Russia and a stable, profitable power-sharing deal with the United States, which way do you think Beijing would go? For Iran, the consequences are even worse. China is Iran's most important economic lifeline. It's the main buyer of Iranian oil, often using back channels to get around U.S. sanctions, providing the cash that keeps the regime alive. China, along with Russia, has also given Iran diplomatic protection and growing military support. If the U.S. convinces China to become its partner in managing Iran, that lifeline could be cut. The Trump administration could essentially outsource its maximum pressure campaign to Beijing, asking China to enforce sanctions in exchange for other benefits. This would leave Iran completely and utterly isolated. This potential new world order is a huge gamble for everyone. For the U.S., it's a tempting shortcut to solving its most painful foreign policy headaches. It could lead to a more stable world, managed by the two biggest economies. But the price would be legitimizing China's authoritarian government, possibly trading democratic values for short-term stability, and angering traditional U.S. allies in Europe and Asia who would be left out of this new club. For China, the offer is everything it's been striving for over decades. It would be a final confirmation of its superpower status, giving it co-ownership of the global system. But it would also force Beijing into a tricky balancing act. It would mean betraying its no-limits partner in Moscow and abandoning its proxy in Tehran, which could wreck its credibility with other countries that are suspicious of U.S. power. It would also tie China's own future more closely to the famously unpredictable politics of Washington, D.C. The phone call on February 4th didn't create this new world, but it might have laid the foundation. It was the moment the idea of a U.S.-China G2 jumped from academic papers into the real world of high-stakes diplomacy. The aftershocks of this one conversation will decide whether Russia and Iran stay as independent players in a multipolar world or become second-tier pieces in a new bipolar era run by Washington and Beijing. The map isn't redrawn yet, but they're the ones holding the pen. This is the kind of analysis we do here, connecting the dots between events that seem unrelated to show you the bigger picture. The world is getting more complex, and understanding these hidden connections is more important than ever. If you find this kind of deep dive valuable, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We are always tracking these developments, and you don't want to miss what's next. So, what do we make of this one phone call? Was it really the day the world map was redrawn? The truth is, history doesn't usually pivot on a single moment. It's shaped by powerful, deep currents that pull countries in certain directions. The phone call between Donald Trump and Xi Jinping on February 4th wasn't the earthquake itself. It was the tremor that revealed the incredible pressure building up along the fault lines of our global order. What this conversation exposed was the huge difference in how the United States and China see the world. We saw the American approach, transactional, focused on immediate, measurable wins, and driven by a dealmaker's faith in personal relationships. And we saw the Chinese approach, strategic, patient, and built on non-negotiable principles of sovereignty and a demand for a new kind of global respect. We saw how the shaky truce on trade is tied directly to the military flashpoint of Taiwan. We saw Xi Jinping use the call to draw his brightest red line yet, making it clear that any economic partnership depends on American actions in the Taiwan Strait. The future of that island, and the peace of the entire region, now hangs on whether the U.S. values a presidential visit to Beijing more than its long-standing promise to defend Taiwan. And most profoundly, we saw the faint outline of a new world order, a G2 duopoly, where Washington and Beijing try to run the world together. It's a tempting vision of stability, but it's one that would come at the expense of powers like Russia and Iran, and could upend America's alliances with its democratic friends. It presents a stark choice, a world managed by two competing superpowers, or a messier, more chaotic world of many competing powers. The phone call didn't give us any easy answers. Instead, it left us with a set of urgent and incredibly important questions. Can a transactional leader and a strategic leader find enough common ground to keep their competition from turning into a conflict? Can you build a stable relationship when one side's business interests are in direct conflict with the other's core security needs? And is the world even ready for a G2, a duopoly that could sideline the very system that has governed the world for nearly 80 years? This conversation may have happened behind closed doors, but its consequences will play out for all of us to see. This phone call didn't redraw the map overnight, but it may have been the moment the map makers of the 21st century were told to get ready. The old maps are out of date. A new world is taking shape. Thanks for watching.